believers and all young groovies, here's another fantabulous Top of the Pops album by Hallmark. Just look at some of the really meaty, beaty numbers. Bad Moon Rising in the year 2525, and that smash hit from her, Good Morning Sunshine. All high up in the charts. Let your hair down and feel free to shoot way up into space to these smashing, crashing modern sounds.
It could be argued that the cover version has never been more popular than in recent years, with the slew of Here Today, Gone Later Today, Pop Idol and X Factor contestants cranking out bland facsimiles of popular hits from yesteryear, and often having more chart success than the original recordings. Some of these cookie-cutter products even churn out entire albums of disposable cover songs before vanishing back into the obscurity that they were unnecessarily plucked from to begin with. But one particular form of cover version has long since vanished into the mists of time. From the middle of the 1960s until around 1987, the racks of retailers like Woolworths would be crammed with LPs consisting of sound-alike recordings that were cranked out while the original hit was still in the charts. These budget-price collections were pitched at an unfussy audience who were happy to have 16 or so songs, vaguely resembling the original if you didn't listen too closely, for the price of a single 7-inch. They were, at the peak of popularity, several different collections running up multiple volumes. Hot Hits, 12 Tops, Chartbusters, Solid Gold, Parade of Pops and others that appeared every few weeks. All followed the pattern set by the unquestioned market leader, the mighty Top of the Pops series that ran for 92 volumes, plus annual Best Of compilations from 1968 to 1985. The Top of the Pops LPs were launched on Pickwick's budget label Hallmark, the brainchild of producer Alan Crawford, who had seen the success of earlier EPs and then LPs featuring anonymous cover versions of recent chart hits. Records were, even then, not cheap, especially if you were a pop-mad kid with limited spending power, and so an album full of the latest hit singles had a certain appeal, even if the recordings were not by the original artists. And in the 1960s and into the 70s, it wasn't unusual for the songs of the Beatles and other top artists to be immediately covered and issued as singles by both big names and hopeful nobodies, so these albums were perhaps not such a shock to the system. Indeed, throughout the 1970s and beyond, there was also a market for entire budget LPs featuring sound-alike recordings of single bands like ABBA for people who couldn't or wouldn't afford the real thing, as well as weird disco-styled versions of songs by decidedly undisco bands. Check out our coverage of the Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin disco records for more on this. The Top of the Pops LPs had two things going for them that the earlier recordings and their later rivals didn't have. One was the name, cheekily swiped from the BBC's flagship pop show when it was discovered that there was no copyright on the title. Top of the Pops was where the undiscerning pop fan and their families heard these songs to begin with, and so the name implied a certain connection and authenticity. The other selling point was the cover design. An immediately recognisable logo with a listing of the songs included, both large enough to spot from quite a distance, and a photo of a sexy glamour girl to lure in the dads. These would feature many a famous Dolly Bird, Page 3 girl and cult movie actress of the time, from Katja Wyeth, Penny Irving and Susie Shaw to blonde on blonde pair Nina Carter and Jilly Johnson, Big D Nuts girl Beverly Pilkington, and, on the final two releases, Linda Lusardi and Samantha Fox taking the discs firmly into the 1980s, and so creating a curious cultural history that spanned the series' length. Unlike some of their rivals, the Top of the Pops LPs were reasonably circumspect in their imagery. While Volume 16 caused a touch of controversy with a photo of a model in a transparent top, this was still mild compared to other LP covers, and the other covers in the series studiously avoided nudity. Some had models posing sexily, others could have appeared on the cover of Woman's Own, quite frankly. But taken as a whole, they're an intriguing representation of the changing face of the glamour girl over the decade and a bit that the series ran. On the back were sleeve notes, more like a desperate hard sell, that extolled the virtues of this latest recording, written in early editions by Groovy Boy and hyping the LP with such hyperbolic commentary As ravers want to be shot so high you'll hit the moon, then take this album, listen and jump, jump, jump higher and higher to the swinging beat of the current explosive top pop tunes. Well, quite. In later years, the sleeve notes would be toned down and then finally dropped, poor old Groovy Boy, while the back covers went from plain text-driven white card to full-colour reproductions of the front cover photos. The series really hit its stride in 1971 when Bruce Baxter took over as producer. Baxter brought in his own team of singers and session players led by Tony Rivers, and the whole production was turned into a well-oiled machine. Songs would be chosen on a Friday, with the singers sent off to buy the singles chosen and then write down the lyrics. If they couldn't be deciphered, educated guesses came into play, while a quick arrangement was worked out for recordings in the next few days. As with the Top of the Pops TV show, the only criteria for inclusion was if the song had made the top 30, which meant that the musicians had to be able to knock out passable versions of some songs that might not have otherwise easily lent themselves to being covered. Standard pop was generally simple enough. Songs like Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody or Kate Bush's Wuthering Heights were more of a challenge, and the results could be variable. Bohemian Rhapsody is widely accepted as a more than decent stab, knocked out in a few hours by series regular Rivers. Wuthering Heights, on the other hand, is genuinely shocking.
I see a little silhouette of a man. Scaramouche, will you do the fandango? Thunderbolt and lightning, very, very frightening. Galileo, Figaro. Magnifico! Just leave behind my wandering behind the heat. It's me, your candy, I come home and I'm so cold.
Some tracks are perhaps accidentally inspired reworkings. Motorhead's Ace of Spades replaces Lemmy's presumably inimitable guttural vocals with a new wave snare, for example, while the cover of Bowie's Life on Mars is genuinely great, adding a grandiose sense of majesty that's astounding. I won't say that it's better than the original, but it's quite something. The series was popular enough that it also spawned an annual best of that came with a free pin-up calendar, a European edition featuring newly recorded Europop hits. The original LPs, often repackaged and renamed, were also released in countries as varied as France, Germany, Italy, Israel, Turkey and the Lebanon. There was the Sing and Play series of albums featuring covers of songs by a single artist, performed by the Top of the Poppers, the Top of the Tots children's LPs, and assorted compilation albums collated from tracks originally on the Top of the Pops albums. These cover albums also became briefly eligible for the charts, with volume 20 of Top of the Pops actually hitting the top spot, ironically displacing Rod Stewart's Every Picture Tells a Story featuring Maggie May, with an album that covered the same track. Shortly after this, albums of this sort were disqualified from the charts, much as later compilations like Now That's What I Call Music were in the 1980s. Nevertheless, by volume 75 in August 1979, the LPs could boast of having sold over 20 million copies. And of course there were the rival collections. The main competition came from Music for Pleasure's Hot Hits, a virtually identical project that had actually been first to the starting line, more or less. Bill Wellings had launched the whole cover version collections concept back in 1962 with the EP series Top 6, which packed half a dozen sound-alike versions of current hits onto a 7-inch EP. Suggestions by Wellings that listeners would not be able to tell the difference were a bit questionable. Not only were the cover versions clearly not the real thing, but squeezing 3 tracks onto each side meant a reduced sound quality. Still, the records sold well and continued until 1967, when the series had passed volume 40. But by that year, the album market was surpassing that of the 7-inch and the EP was on its way out. Wellings experimented with top 12 and top 10 spectacular LP versions of the same format before joining forces with Music for Pleasure, EMI's budget label, for the Hot Hits series, though it started out at first as Smash Hits and Hit 70s before a rethink saw the series rebadged and the covers copying the Top of the Pops format, featuring scantily clad glamour models. But as the series progressed, a theme was developed, with the models posing in assorted sporty activities, with photography that arguably outdid the Top of the Pops albums and featured different images on both the front and back. Hot Hits made it to volume 20 in 1973 when Wellings left the project and Music for Pleasure closed it down. Another long-running rival was 12 Tops, the name and cover format clearly designed to confuse the series with Top of the Pops. It's safe to say that the buyers of these albums were not paying that much attention to anything other than the list of songs included, and often not even that. Launched by David Leonard Miller and the magnificently named Monty Presky, the series began in 1972 after a few releases under the Chart Toppers name. The albums, issued on the Stereo Gold Award label that existed specifically for such releases, ran until 1976, clocking up 30 editions. Equally prolific was England's Top 12 Hits, which ran from 1969 to 1974 and featured 30 releases on the Obscure Avenue label. Although each edition, as you would expect, featured a glamour model on the cover, the design was otherwise somewhat inconsistent, which probably didn't help build a following. World Top 12, which ran for 19 volumes between 1970 and 1975, was mostly notable for the slightly raunchier cover images. While rival collections tended to steer clear of actual nudity, this collection was more overtly sexual and had at least 3 editions that featured fully bare breasts and others that came close. Similarly provocative, at least to begin with, was Pie's Chartbusters, which itself was a continuation of a 22-volume series on the Marble Arch label that had run from 1968 to 1971. When Pie took over the series in 1971, it relaunched it with a no-nonsense topless shot of model Nicola Austin, which was perhaps a bit too upfront even for an age where nudity was everywhere. Later editions dialed back the sexiness, and the series ran for another 16 volumes up to 1975. There were plenty more that all followed the same format. A pin-up girl on the cover, around 12 to 16 recent hits on the vinyl. Parade of Pops clocked up 25 editions between 1972 and 1976. Hit Parade Special released 9 LPs between 1970 and 1973, and plenty of others came and went with a few editions or single entries. These were not records for the serious collector. Not only would you find the same song across several records, but often they will be the same recordings, as a cottage industry sprang up to serve the expanding need for cheap, fast cover versions. Some of these featured respected session musicians and jobbing artists on their way to bigger things, the biggest of these being Reg Dwight, soon to be reinvented as Elton John. Before long, he went from performing cover versions of chart hits to seeing his own songs covered for these albums. He could hardly complain, I guess. Indeed, it remains unclear just what the original artist made of all this at the time. On the one hand, it might be argued that these quick knockoffs were robbing the proper records of sales. On the other hand, a bit like home taping and illegal downloading, how many of the people getting their music this way were ever going to buy the legitimate records is open to question. For songwriters, the cover versions probably increased their income. For performers, not so much. But the cover version LPs were like a dirty secret, sold everywhere but discussed by no one, existing in a parallel universe that the radio stations, chart companies, serious record collectors and serious record shops completely ignored. They are the definition of ephemeral pop, designed to be relevant for a few weeks at most and then replaced with the next edition. As mentioned earlier, by volume 75 in August 1979, the Top of the Pops LPs could boast of having sold over 20 million copies. But even as the album covers boasted of this success, the writing was on the wall. Bruce Baxter left the series at the end of 1978, and Hallmark decided that, rather than replace him and his team, they would instead buy in tracks from Coon Music, who cranked out covers for a variety of labels. The problem here was obvious. These songs were not bought exclusively, and so the exact same cover would turn up on other rival LPs, often in the same month. Even the buyers of these cover version albums were not so undiscerning that they would put up the same remake across several records, and sales started to decline rapidly as too many companies climbed on the bandwagon. More significantly, labels like K-Tel and Ronco had started to release low-price LPs featuring the original recordings of recent hits. And in 1983, the Now That's What I Call Music series was launched, effectively sounding the death knell for cover version LPs. The Top of the Pops series effectively ended in 1982 with Volume 91, returning for a 1984 Best Of and a final edition in 1985. 1982 seemed to be the end of the line generally for the format. Chevron, a Woolworth exclusive label, launched Parade of Pops in 1978, initially as a cassette-only label before issuing several volumes on vinyl, gold-coloured vinyl at that, and then reverting to tape only for the last few editions, the series winding up in Volume 23 in 1982. Solid Gold dragged the format into the 1980s with 3 releases between 1981 and 1982, but couldn't go any further. Weirdly, Chartbusters on the Here and Now label attempted to update the format after a few years of silence in 1986, initially featuring immediately dated 80s style cover illustrations, but reverting to the tried and tested world of sexy girls for the last 2 editions in 1987. 2 more Glamour Girl Free series from Chevron called Hits, Hits, Hits and This Is Music, both titled in the hope of fooling the less observant Now That's What I Call Music and Hits customers, each lasted for a handful of cassette editions between 1984 and 86. This Is Music even issued 2 Best of the Year editions featuring 1970s style Glamour Girl covers. By this time though, the format was extremely tired and rather pointless. With numerous collections now featuring the actual hits available, there was clearly no need for these pale imitations. Still, the albums have never quite died. Sure, there are no new recordings, but several of the Top of the Pops LPs were reissued on CD in the 1990s, and a decade later the entire series was digitised and made available to buy on download. The original albums, of course, are mainstays of charity shops and car boot sales, and there's a small but eager fan base for them. You'll perhaps be unsurprised to know that the fan base includes myself. I have about half of the Top of the Pops releases so far, as well as numerous examples of their rivals. Of course, the problem with this kind of collecting is that you can never remember which albums you have and which albums you don't have. Invariably, I've bought the same LP more than once. My rule of thumb for buying these has usually been a top price of 50p per album, but in a world of inflation I might be willing to go up to £1 these days. Most copies have sleeves that come unglued, a sign of how cheaply they were put together or how undiscerning the original owners were when looking after their records perhaps. But the cover art alone makes these a must-have items for fans of 1970s kitsch and 1970s glamour girls, while the music is startling, eccentric, sometimes extraordinary. Removed from the context of having to pass as a duplicate for a current chart smash, they can now flourish as oddball covers in their own right. some coming impressively close to the original, some wandering off into strange new directions. And if nothing else, the albums are a somewhat definitive record of just what pop music the British masses were listening to between 1968 and 1982. A complete box set of all the Top of the Pops releases would have genuine historical value. A book on the records has been in the works for several years and hopefully will be out at some point. I definitely look forward to seeing it. As ever, I'm interested to know what you make of these records. Do you have any favourite cover versions that appear on them, or indeed any favourite covers? Or for that matter, do you have a collection that you want to upload? Let us know in the comments. Just bear in mind what I said earlier about how much I'm willing to pay for these things. If you appreciate the time and effort that's put into these deep dives into entirely pointless cultural history, then feel free to support us on Patreon or buy me a coffee, give us a super thanks, or simply like and share this video. If this is your sort of thing, then you might want to also subscribe to be sure that you won't miss any of our future productions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.